My name is Tony Young. I was one of the early fellows in 1969. I'm actually a chartered civil engineer, but I went to North America, the United States and Canada, to study urban public transport. In the 1960s, it was thought that the car was going to be the only means of transport that mattered. And public transport really was just going to die a natural death. I knew that wasn't going to be true, but I wanted to see what was happening in North America because their car ownership levels were about 20 years ahead of those in Britain. It was the most valuable trip of my lifetime in many more ways than one. So I did learn a great deal about transport policy over there, and one of the key things I found was they were not letting their public transport systems die, they were investing in them very heavily. And so I came back to Britain full of bright ideas as to what we should be doing, and I was very fortunate in that I came back just at the time when a brand new transport authority was being set up in Greater Manchester. There was a seminar when I was asked to give a talk, and to cut a long story short, on the strength of that, I obtained a job with the new transport authority. On my travels, I visited universities, transport authorities, bus and metro rail operators, in fact any organisation that was involved with transport. And I had the most amazing reception. You only had to mention the word Churchill and it was like a passport, because the Americans were obviously, especially at that time, they all remembered Churchill, what he had stood for, what he achieved, and to be a Churchill Fellow was really quite something. So of course that benefited my studies enormously. I had to plan my fellowship very carefully because in those days we had no computers, no word processors, and of course no email. We take email for granted nowadays, and virtually all communication is done by email. But in my case, it had to be done by old-fashioned post, letters in both directions, of course. And then when I arrived in each city, I would make contact by telephone, because everything had to be finalised fairly quickly. But it all worked remarkably well. The award of the fellowship, which in my case was about £1,500 in those days, that's worth about £22,000 today, and that covered absolutely everything. Travel by air, road, rail, and coming back on Queen Elizabeth II because I couldn't get all my papers onto an aeroplane. And the generosity of the Trust, to me, was unbelievable. The Churchill leaflet for 1969 had on the front Churchill's statement that with opportunities comes responsibility. And he actually said that in 1946, long before the Churchill Fellowship was set up. And that was definitely true in my case, because the opportunities were quite out of this world. You have to remember that in the 1960s, to travel to North America for any ordinary human being was almost unheard of. The advice from the Churchill Trust back in 1969 was very specific, and I don't think it has changed. You have to have a clear idea of where you want to go, what you want to do there, how you're going to do it, and how will that benefit you when you return to Great Britain. Luckily, I did have a clear idea, and I worked out my itinerary, the sort of people I wanted to interview, the places I wanted to go. But another key factor was referees. We had to give 2 referees. The 2 I chose were my academic boss, the professor of the department, and at a more personal level, the university chaplain, who I happen to know quite well. I don't know what they wrote, but it must have been remarkably good for me to have been awarded that fellowship. So make sure you get referees who know you and who understand your project, because they will support you. But the most important thing is to know what you will be able to do when you come back, to apply whatever it is that you have learned when you're over there. When I applied for my Churchill Fellowship, it was not all that long after Churchill had died. He died in 1965, I applied in 1968. So the name of Churchill was still very well known and understood amongst everybody. He was the person who uniquely had saved Britain during the Second World War. His qualities are obviously the key inspiration to the whole work of the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust. And I think whatever you may think of Churchill's politics or his war service or anything else, he was a remarkable man. And those qualities have carried on in the Trust. And I would like to think that in some very small way, I have picked those up, and they have certainly inspired me through my fellowship years and, of course, right up, well, throughout my life.